Imagine, for a moment, that you are living in Europe, many centuries ago. It is winter. The year is perhaps the 12th century, or the 13th. The land looks very different than what you know today. The castles are not fairy tale wonders, but cold, damp stone fortresses. The villages are small clusters of wooden huts, their roofs weighed down with snow. And the nights are long, very long indeed. The medieval winter was not a season of comfort. It was, for many, a time of survival, a time of scarcity, a time when every day was measured not by progress, but by endurance. Unlike today, there was no central heating, no electric lamps, no supermarkets filled with food from all over the world. Instead, life was bound tightly to the rhythm of the seasons, and winter was always the harshest test of that rhythm. One of the first difficulties of medieval winter was food. By the time the cold months arrived, everything depended on what had been harvested in autumn. Grains, root vegetables, salted meats, and dried fish were stored in cellars and granaries, but supplies were never guaranteed. If the harvest had been poor, hunger would follow. Imagine the shelves of a medieval storeroom, barrels filled with salted pork, baskets of turnips and onions, a few sacks of rye or barley, perhaps some cheese, aged and hardened. Every bite had to be rationed carefully. Fresh fruits and vegetables were simply unavailable. The peasants and townsfolk ate what could last. Gruels and pottages, thick soups made from whatever remained, were the staple. Over the weeks and months, the meals grew more monotonous, and the quantities smaller. By February, when winter seemed endless, famine often threatened. The time between the exhaustion of the old harvest and the arrival of the new one was known as the hungry gap. For many medieval families, this gap was the season of greatest suffering. The cold itself was another unrelenting enemy. Peasants' cottages were built of wood, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs that leaked heat. A central hearth provided warmth, but much of the smoke lingered inside the home. The air was thick, the ceilings blackened with soot, and still the cold seeped in through every crack. Families and even animals sometimes slept together in the same room. The body heat of cows, goats, and pigs, helping to raise the temperature slightly. Children huddled under wool blankets, or furs if they were lucky, while the wind howled outside. In castles, the situation was little better. Great halls were heated by enormous fireplaces. But even so, the warmth did not spread far. Guests and lords often kept their cloaks on indoors. Chambers away from the fire were frigid, their stone walls radiating chill. Windows, when they existed at all, were covered in oiled cloth or wooden shutters, not glass. The drafts were constant. Winter clothing meant layers of wool, linen, and sometimes leather. The wealthy might have fur-lined garments, but peasants had only what they could weave themselves. Winter also slowed the rhythm of work. Fields lay dormant, covered in frost and snow. But survival tasks never ceased. Firewood had to be gathered, though forests were cold and dangerous. Animals had to be fed and sheltered, or else they would perish, and with them, the family's future food supply. Peasants repaired tools, wove cloth, and made whatever items were possible indoors. Women spun wool, men mended harnesses. Children were set to small tasks, their hands always busy. But even with all this, winter meant long stretches of idleness. When the sun set early, darkness swallowed the hours. Candles were precious, and most people could not afford to burn them freely. Instead, they went to bed soon after nightfall, sleeping long hours, broken by waking in the cold of the night. Another cruel reality of winter was illness. The cold and damp made lungs weak, and respiratory infections were common. Medical care, as we think of it today, hardly existed. A fever could be deadly. Pneumonia, influenza, or even the simplest of colds often worsened into something fatal. Malnutrition weakened the body's resistance. Children, the elderly, and the poor suffered most. Mortality rates climbed in the winter months. And then there was the psychological burden. Imagine the endless gray skies, the monotony of snow and mud, the confinement to small, dim spaces. Life shrank to survival routines, and the hope of spring became the only comfort. Festivals, such as Christmas and later Carnival, were vital in breaking the monotony. They gave people moments of joy, of song, of feasting, if supplies allowed. These holidays were not luxuries. They were necessary lifelines for morale. If you were a peasant in those times, winter was perhaps the greatest trial of the year. Life was already hard in the warmer months, when long hours in the fields demanded strength and stamina. But in winter, when the earth froze and farming stopped, hardship took another form. Days were shorter, nights stretched endlessly, and the firewood piles shrank faster than anyone hoped. Families often crowded into the single warmest space of their small cottages, sharing not only warmth but the constant smoke that curled from the hearth. Eyes watered, lungs burned, yet the alternative was colder still. Meals were plain and repetitive. A bowl of thick porridge, maybe a crust of bread, perhaps a little ale to warm the body. The poorest peasants had little variety and often less than enough, and if animals died in the cold, then milk, eggs, and meat disappeared, making hunger heavier. It was not uncommon for families to slaughter a pig at the start of winter and salt the meat, trying to make it last until spring. Each bite carried a calculation: should they eat now for strength, or save for later, when things might become worse? The nobles, though wealthier, also felt the season. A lord in his castle could command stores of food, and there would be feasts in the great hall. Spices, dried fruits, and wines made winter more tolerable for the rich. Yet castles were not cozy places. The walls were of stone, thick and cold, with drafts that no tapestry could fully block. A roaring fire warmed those who sat closest, but further away the air was damp and biting. Servants rushed about, cloaked in wool, their hands stiff from carrying water that froze in the pails. Even the highborn wore layers of fur indoors. Comfort was relative, but true warmth was elusive for all. Monks, too, faced their own version of the season. In monasteries, daily life followed strict routines, regardless of weather. Prayers at dawn, chanting in unheated chapels. Study by dim light all continued, even as frost clung to cloisters and icicles formed on stone arches. Monks rose in the early hours when the air was most bitter. Their robes were simple, woolen habits that offered little protection against the icy drafts that swept through old abbey walls. Yet their discipline kept them steady. They copied texts by candlelight, their fingers numb, the ink stiffening in the chill. Fasting, prayer, and endurance were not just spiritual trials but physical ones, woven into every winter. Travel in these months was dangerous. Roads were muddy, frozen, or buried under snow. A journey that might take a day in summer could stretch to several in winter, with risks of frostbite, hunger, or simply becoming lost in storms. Merchants who carried goods often delayed their journeys until spring. Only those with urgent missions, messengers, armies, or pilgrims braved the elements. Villages and towns grew more isolated. For ordinary people, the world shrank to the boundaries of their community until the thaw returned. Sometimes, winters were harsher than usual. In the later Middle Ages, Europe experienced what we now call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures fell lower than normal. Harvests failed, and rivers froze. Chroniclers wrote of birds dropping from the sky, of wolves venturing into villages in search of food, of frost that killed even the strongest cattle. The Thames in London froze solid in some winters, turning into a wide, icy expanse. People held fairs on the ice, but beneath the laughter was always the fear of famine and death. When food ran low, desperation followed. Records speak of famine years, when people boiled weeds and roots for soup, when children starved, when bread was stretched with ground-up bark or sawdust. Hunger weakened entire communities, and disease followed close behind. A simple cough, an infected wound, or a winter fever could sweep through a household where everyone was already thin and weary. Survival was never certain. The sounds of winter were different too. Instead of buzzing fields and birdsong, the world grew quiet. The crunch of snow underfoot, the creak of frozen wood, the constant cough of neighbors, these filled the air. Dogs barked at shadows, and the howling of wolves in the distance was no myth. Wild animals grew bolder when hunger drove them near human settlements. For those who lived on the edge of forests, the night carried both mystery and fear. Darkness pressed heavily. With the sun setting early, much of life took place in shadow. Candles were valuable, made from tallow or beeswax, and not to be wasted. Many evenings ended soon after sunset, families retreating to bed, not always to sleep, but to conserve energy and warmth. People spoke in hushed voices, told stories to pass the hours, or prayed together. Time itself seemed slower, stretched out by the lack of light. Festivals offered a welcome break in this long gloom. At Christmas, even the poor sought to celebrate. A little ale might be brewed, a pig slaughtered, or bread shared more generously. The church held masses, filling the cold air with song and ritual. These moments brought communities together, giving them strength to endure the weeks ahead. Later, in February or March, Carnival and Lent marked another cycle of feasting and fasting, a reminder that spring was near. Without these markers, the endless sameness of winter might have been unbearable. Yet even with festivals, winters wore people down. A child born in December had little chance of survival if food was scarce. An elderly villager weakened quickly in the damp cold. Even strong men could perish if sickness struck, or if they ventured too far into the snow. Death was common, and communities buried their dead in frozen ground, sometimes unable to dig graves until the thaw. Still, life went on. Each winter was endured with the hope of spring, with prayers for mercy, with the determination to last just a little longer. And when the first shoots of green appeared in the fields, when lambs were born, when rivers thawed, there was relief, joy, and gratitude. Another winter survived meant another chance at life, another chance to plant, to reap, to gather before the cycle repeated again. In the worst winters, the season became more than an inconvenience. It became a true enemy, one that shaped the stories and fears of entire communities. Hunger was always close, and when harvests failed or storms struck too early, famine followed swiftly. People remembered these winters for generations, telling their children about the year the rivers froze too hard, or the year when there was no bread until May. Chroniclers of the Middle Ages sometimes described these years with stark simplicity. The poor ate grass, wrote one monk. Another recorded that people dug up roots from the frozen earth, boiling them in desperation. Some accounts speak of darker things, of theft, of neighbors turning against one another when supplies ran out. In times of famine, villages emptied as people wandered in search of food, hoping another region had fared better. But often, they found only more suffering. The psychological weight of winter was heavier than we can easily imagine. Days without sunlight, weeks of sameness, and the knowledge that every meal eaten was one less for tomorrow. These pressures wore on the mind. People grew anxious, irritable, or deeply weary. Faith became an anchor. The church provided not only rituals and prayers, but also a framework for understanding hardship. A brutal winter was seen as a test, perhaps a punishment, or perhaps a reminder of human dependence on divine mercy. Superstitions clung to the season as well. Some believed that spirits were closer in the long nights of winter, that the howling winds carried more than just weather. Old tales warned against traveling after dark, for unseen forces might linger in the forests and fields. People believed in signs: the cracking of ice, the flight of birds, the strange shapes in frost on windows. Every sound and pattern in nature seemed to carry meaning when survival was at stake. Animals, too, shaped the mood of winter. Cows grew thinner as hay dwindled. Chickens laid fewer eggs. Horses lost their strength without grain. Families often faced painful choices about which animals to feed and which to slaughter. A cow that survived the winter was precious, for it meant milk in spring and calves for the future. A pig could be salted to provide meat for months, but once eaten, it was gone forever. Every decision balanced immediate hunger against long-term survival. Inside homes, life was slow. Tasks filled the hours: mending clothes, twisting rope, patching roofs, carving wooden tools. But time still dragged. The smoke from the hearth stung the eyes, and the darkness pressed heavily. People told stories to children, repeated tales of saints and heroes, recited family histories, or sang old songs. Repetition created rhythm, and rhythm helped the days pass. For children, winters were both dull and strange. Games were limited, yet snow offered moments of play. They might carve shapes in the frost, slide on frozen ponds, or chase one another through the drifts. But hunger and cold did not spare the young. Many winters carried away the frailest children, leaving families grieving when spring returned. Parents often reminded surviving children of the siblings they had lost, weaving memory into the cycle of the seasons. Even in towns and cities, the season was difficult. Markets shrank, goods grew expensive, and beggars multiplied on the streets. Bakers sometimes mixed sawdust or ground beans into bread to stretch it further, and riots erupted when flour was scarce. Fires threatened entire neighborhoods as people crowded around hearths and braziers, desperate for warmth. Cold stone streets froze, and water supplies turned to ice. The wealthy withdrew into their manors, but the poor huddled in alleys and barns, sharing what little shelter they could find. Strange natural events added to the sense of unease. Sometimes winters brought heavy storms, freezing rains that coated everything in ice. Trees split under the weight, roofs collapsed, animals perished in their stalls. At other times, snow fell so deep that roads vanished, and villages became islands surrounded by white silence. Chroniclers described whole armies stalled by snow, unable to march or fight, forced to wait for weeks before moving again. When the cold dragged on too long, it felt endless. People measured time by saints' days and festivals, but when Lent arrived and snow still lay on the ground, despair deepened. The hungry gap stretched wider. Hope seemed fragile. Only the faintest signs, the cry of a bird returning, the first drip of meltwater, the slight lengthening of daylight reminded people that change was coming. Survival depended on community as much as on individual effort. Neighbors often shared when they could. A family with a little more grain might lend it, knowing that next year they themselves might need help. Villagers gathered for prayers, for small feasts, for rituals that affirmed life amid the cold. These bonds held people together. Without them, the long nights would have been far darker. There were, of course, those who suffered most. The poor, the sick, the elderly, and the orphaned were the most vulnerable. Churches and monasteries sometimes offered alms bread, soup, or shelter, but resources were limited. For many, charity was the only hope of survival. Stories of miracles circulated, tales of saints who brought food in times of famine, or visions of warmth granted to the faithful. Whether believed as literal truth or symbolic comfort, these stories offered people a reason to endure. And so, the cycle of winters continued. Each year, people prepared as best they could. Each year, some failed to survive. But always, spring returned. The thaw came, the fields softened, animals gave birth, and the earth seemed to forgive the harshness of the cold. Relief spread quickly, almost like joy, as green replaced gray, and hunger eased with the first new foods of the season. It was never easy, but each winter endured, carried with it the knowledge that endurance itself was possible. The truth of medieval winters is that they were both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because they returned every year, shaping the rhythm of life as surely as the harvest and the turning of the seasons. Extraordinary, because each winter tested the strength of families and communities in ways that were never guaranteed. To live through one was an achievement. To live through many was a testament to patience, resilience, and endurance. For the people of those centuries, winter was not an enemy that could be defeated. It was more like a stern teacher, demanding preparation, humility, and respect. People gathered what they could, stored what they could, mended what they could. They understood that survival depended not on comfort but on discipline and caution. Nothing could be wasted. A cracked pot, a frayed cloak, a half-broken tool were repaired again and again. Because in the middle of February, there would be no replacements, no markets full of choices, no endless supply of new things. What you had was what you had, and you made it last. The quiet of winter had its own strange beauty. The snow muffled the world, softening sounds, turning familiar fields into blank, white expanses. The stars were sharp and cold in the night sky, more vivid than in summer. Frost sparkled on branches and rooftops, catching the faint light of the moon. Children might have marveled at these things, even while shivering in thin shoes and patched cloaks. Adults, too, must have noticed, though perhaps they did not always speak of it, weighed down as they were by hunger and responsibility. Yet the world was never entirely without wonder. Even in hardship, there were moments of stillness, of silence, of awe. As the long months wore on, routine became survival. Wake, tend the fire, feed the animals, eat the small meal, mend the tools, tell the stories, sleep, wake again. The sameness of days blurred into one another, but sameness could be a comfort as well as a burden. The mind grew used to repetition, and in its rhythm, there was endurance. Stories carried people through the cold, tales of saints who endured suffering, of ancestors who survived terrible years, of heroes who triumphed over hardship. These narratives reminded people that winter was not the end of all things, only a season among seasons. Some stories were warnings, others encouragements, but all gave shape to the otherwise shapeless dark. Around the fire, children listened with wide eyes, not only entertained but prepared, in their own way, for the winters of their future. The church bells still rang, even in the snow. The sound traveled over frozen fields, steady and familiar. It was a reminder that life continued, that prayers were still said, that community still existed beyond the walls of each small home. In those bells was the heartbeat of the medieval world, slow and regular, tying one winter to the next. When at last spring came, it was almost like waking from a dream. The first thaw, the first green shoots, the first flowing water, all were celebrated with relief. People who had been thin and pale through the cold began to eat better, to move with more energy, to smile again. Animals gave birth, fields were plowed, seeds were planted. The cycle began again, as it always did. Yet memories of the winter lingered. Each family remembered what they had lost, who they had lost, and what they had learned about their own strength. The legacy of those winters is still with us, though we do not feel it so sharply now. Central heating, supermarkets, insulated homes, these shield us from the raw edge of the cold that once shaped every life. But if you listen to the old records, to the chronicles of monks, to the stories passed down, you can still hear the echo of those long nights, those hungry days, those desperate prayers for spring. It is easy, now, to forget how fragile survival once was. But in remembering, there is a kind of quiet respect. Respect for the peasants who patched their roofs with frozen fingers. Respect for the mothers who rationed food so carefully. Respect for the monks who rose at dawn in icy cloisters to chant their prayers. Respect for the children who played in the snow even when their bellies were empty. Respect for the countless unnamed people who lived through winter after winter, shaping the world that eventually became ours. So when we think of medieval winters, we might imagine hardship and cold, but we should also imagine persistence. The steady breath of people who kept going, day after day, even when the days were short and the nights long. The steady rhythm of work and prayer, of hunger and hope, of suffering and survival. And as the story drifts to its end, perhaps it is fitting that it slows, the way winter itself slowed everything. Time stretching, voices quieting, the fires sinking lower in the hearth. Outside, the snow still lies heavy, the wind still presses against the shutters, but inside, there is warmth enough to wait. Spring will come, as it always does. The cold will pass, as it always has. And the memory of another winter endured will fade into the rhythm of history, where it waits, quietly, for us to remember again.